We gotta get you dressed, kid.
I
Look
know,
what Bella's
right?
eating. Bella's eating some of the ingredients.
She got a nice little bowl of chocolate chips.
Look at that. What is that, Bella? Can you show them? What is it? Is it chocolate?
Is it chocolate?
It's chocolate mini morsels, right? Yeah, good job. So she's been eating my peanut.
Before sunrise, the neighborhood still belonged to routine. Lawns waited for morning light. Driveways held their parked cars in neat alignment. Houses stood quietly, built for families, schedules, noise, and repetition. There was nothing unusual in the air, nothing that suggested urgency or disruption. No alarms. No raised voices. No visible fracture in the order of things. And yet, behind one front door, a life structured around predictability had already collapsed into silence. Chris Watts did not look like a man capable of violence. He did not carry the outward markers people associate with danger. He was soft-spoken, polite.
I could objectively say that this is perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime that I have handled out of the thousands of cases that I have seen. And nothing less than a maximum sentence would be appropriate. And anything less than the maximum sentence would depreciate the seriousness of this offense. Deputies, I would respectfully ask that you take this defendant into custody and have him serve the rest of his life in the Department of Corrections. We are in recess.
Unremarkable. His presence did not demand attention, and that was precisely how he learned to move through the world. He smiled when expected. He agreed when asked. He followed routines with mechanical reliability. To neighbors, coworkers, and even friends, he appeared steady, contained, and harmless. A man who blended into his surroundings so completely that he became nearly invisible. The house he shared with his family reflected the same impression. It was new, orderly, and designed for growth. Children's rooms filled with toys, a kitchen meant for shared meals, a garage that held the vehicles of an ordinary suburban life.
What I'd like to say to the court is that Shanann, Bella, and Nico are loving, caring people. They love life. They love being around people who love them. They always had good times. This is the first time they went to the beach this year, and they loved it. But God only knows what happened that night. Life will never be the same without Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, and Nico. Had all their lives to live. They were taken by a heartless one. This is the heartless one, the evil monster, who dare you take the lives of my daughters Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. I trusted you to take care of them, not kill them. And they also trusted you. The heartless monster, and then you take them out like trash. You disgust me. They were loving and caring people. You may have taken their bodies from me, but you will never take the love they had for me. They loved us more than you will ever know, because you don't know what love is. Because if you did, you would not have killed them. You monster, thought you would get away with this. I don't know how. The cameras do not lie. You carry them out like trash of the house. Yes, I seen the videotape. You buried my daughter Shanann and Nico in a shallow grave, and then you put Bella and Celeste in huge containers of crude oil. You heartless monster. You have to live with this vision every day of your life, and I hope you see that every time you close your eyes at night. Oh, I forgot. You have no heart or feelings or love. Let me tell you something. I will think of them every day of my life, and I love them every day of my life. Prison is too good for you. This is hard to say, but may God have mercy on your soul. I hope you enjoy your new life. It's nothing like the one you had out here. May the courts have no mercy on you. It's hard every day. It hurts in so many ways. I have heard people say that you're not a monster. No, you are not. You're an evil monster. Thank you. Love you, Shanann, Bella, and Nico. Love you, Pop and Dad. And one other thing. And Shanann says she is super excited for justice today.
Unremarkable. His presence did not demand attention, and that was precisely how he learned to move through the world. He smiled when expected. He agreed when asked. He followed routines with mechanical reliability. To neighbors, coworkers, and even friends, he appeared steady, contained, and harmless. A man who blended into his surroundings so completely that he became nearly invisible. The house he shared with his family reflected the same impression. It was new, orderly, and designed for growth. Children's rooms filled with toys, a kitchen meant for shared meals, a garage that held the vehicles of an ordinary suburban life. The walls carried no obvious signs of tension, no marks of violence, no evidence of what was already unfolding within. From the street, it looked like thousands of other homes across America, built to shelter futures that felt secure. Inside that home, however, something had been quietly eroding for years. Chris Watts did not erupt into violence suddenly. What happened was not the result of a single argument or an uncontrollable moment of rage. It was the final outcome of a long process of internal withdrawal. A slow retreat from emotional engagement, a steady refusal to confront discomfort. Over time, silence became his default response to conflict, and avoidance became his primary coping mechanism. To understand what happened, it is necessary to look past the crime itself and into the structure of the life that preceded it. Chris Watts learned early how to disappear without leaving. He learned how to comply without agreeing, how to remain physically present while emotionally absent. In relationships, he did not assert himself. He absorbed. He did not challenge. He endured. Each unspoken frustration settled quietly, never released, never examined, accumulating beneath a calm exterior that rarely cracked. From the outside, the Watts family presented a carefully curated image of stability. Smiling photographs documented birthdays, milestones, and everyday moments. Social media showed a family moving forward together, expanding, planning, and celebrating. Shanann Watts appeared energetic, expressive, and deeply invested in her family's life. She communicated openly. She shared experiences. She narrated their world in real time, inviting others to witness what looked like a loving household built on connection and ambition. Chris appeared beside her in those moments, present but subdued. He smiled for the camera. He participated without resistance. To many observers, he looked like a supportive partner and an attentive father, but appearance masked a growing internal divide. The role he performed outwardly did not match the life he felt trapped within. He did not feel seen, but he also did not seek visibility. Instead, he withdrew further into routine, convincing himself that endurance was easier than confrontation. Over time, endurance turned into detachment. Financial pressure added weight to that detachment. The household carried debt. Expectations mounted. Responsibilities accumulated. Each obligation tightened the structure of a life Chris no longer felt connected to. Yet he did not articulate that disconnect. He did not voice dissatisfaction. He did not challenge decisions. He allowed the narrative of stability to continue uninterrupted while internally distancing himself from its meaning. This emotional distance did not announce itself dramatically. It appeared in subtle shifts, less engagement, shorter responses, a growing sense of absence that Shanann felt but could not fully explain. She asked questions. She sought reassurance. She attempted to reconnect, believing that communication could repair what felt broken. Her instinct was confrontation, honesty, and effort. His instinct was retreat. Rather than addressing conflict, Chris Watts began imagining escape. That imagined escape was not violent at first. It was conceptual. A different life. Fewer responsibilities. A version of himself unburdened by expectations, schedules, and accountability. In that fantasy, he was admired without effort and desired without pressure. When an affair entered his life, the fantasy gained form. It offered a contrast so sharp that his existing life began to feel intolerable by comparison. The affair did not create his detachment. It revealed it. With another woman, Chris experienced a version of himself that required no confrontation, no history, no accumulated resentment. It was not love. It was relief. Relief from responsibility. Relief from being seen as inadequate. Relief from the quiet resentment he had never allowed himself to acknowledge openly. As the fantasy grew stronger, his family receded further into abstraction. They were no longer individuals with needs and emotions. They became symbols of a life he wanted to erase. This shift did not happen in a single moment. It developed gradually, reinforced by silence and avoidance. Each day he chose not to speak honestly. The distance widened. Each day he maintained the appearance of normalcy. The internal rupture deepened. By the time Shanann sensed that something fundamental had changed, Chris had already disengaged. He did not respond to fear with reassurance. He did not respond to confrontation with honesty. He responded with emptiness. The future in his mind had already been rewritten. The people who did not belong in that future were no longer fully real to him. Divorce would have required accountability. It would have demanded explanations, financial consequences, and public acknowledgement of failure. Chris Watts did not want to be the person who caused disruption. He did not want to be seen as the source of pain. Throughout his life, he had avoided being disliked at almost any cost. In his distorted reasoning, erasure felt cleaner than confrontation. What followed was not impulsive. It was calculated. The decision to eliminate his family emerged from the same psychological structure that had defined him for years. Avoidance, silence, control. He reduced human lives to obstacles in a logistical problem. Timing, location, and routine became variables to manage. Emotion was absent from the equation. What remained was a chilling form of problem-solving, stripped of empathy. In the early hours of August 13, 2018, Shanann Watts returned home from a trip. She was exhausted, pregnant, vulnerable. She entered a house she believed still held the possibility of repair. She did not know that the man beside her had already severed himself emotionally from the life they shared. She did not wake up again. What followed inside that house remains one of the most disturbing examples of quiet domestic annihilation in modern true crime. There was no chaos visible to the outside world, no neighbors alerted by noise. No immediate sign that anything had gone wrong. The violence was contained, controlled, and carried out without spectacle. Afterward, Chris Watts moved with disturbing calm. He loaded bodies into his vehicle. He drove to his work site. He disposed of them methodically. Then he returned to routine. Messages were answered. Work tasks completed. The separation between his actions and his demeanor was nearly complete. This dissociation was not new. It was the culmination of years spent disconnecting emotion from behavior. When concern arose about the family's disappearance, Chris stepped easily into the role he had practiced his entire life. The compliant husband, the worried father. He spoke softly. He expressed concern. He asked for help. Standing in front of cameras, he appealed for their safe return, knowing with certainty that they would never come back. The performance was almost convincing. Almost, there was something missing. An urgency that did not surface. A panic that did not arrive. His words sounded appropriate, but they lacked weight. His body language betrayed distance rather than desperation. Investigators noticed it. Friends sensed it. The absence of genuine fear created a subtle but growing unease. As pressure increased, the narrative he attempted to maintain began to fracture. Digital records exposed emotional withdrawal. Messages revealed a man focused not on recovery, but on preservation of his secret life. Timelines shifted. Explanations changed. When denial no longer served him, partial admissions followed. Then blame. He attempted to reshape reality into something that softened his responsibility, presenting himself as reactive rather than deliberate. But the evidence told a different story. This was not a crime of passion. It was a crime of convenience. When the full truth emerged, it shocked not because of its complexity, but because of its simplicity. A man erased his family to pursue a fantasy that dissolved the moment reality intervened. There was no new life waiting, no freedom, no escape, only confinement and the irreversible knowledge of what he had done. Chris Watts is not terrifying because he was extraordinary. He is terrifying because he was ordinary. Because he hid in plain sight. Because his calm demeanor concealed a capacity for absolute betrayal. because he demonstrated how emotional avoidance, unchecked resentment, and profound selfishness can culminate in irreversible destruction. The house that once held routine became a symbol of absence, bedrooms left untouched, schedules abandoned, objects that once carried meaning reduced to evidence. The silence that followed was not peaceful, it was permanent. This case continues to haunt because it offers no comfort, no clear warning signs, no dramatic escalation. It forces a confrontation with the unsettling reality that violence does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in politeness, compliance, and routine. And by the time the silence is noticed, it is already too late. The investigation did not unfold with sudden revelations or dramatic confrontations. It moved slowly, methodically, mirroring the personality of the man at its center. Each step peeled back another layer of routine, another piece of the carefully maintained image that had shielded Chris Watts from scrutiny for so long. What investigators encountered was not a man overwhelmed by grief, but a man inconvenienced by suspicion. From the earliest interviews, his language revealed distance. He spoke about his missing family as though they were already gone, using phrasing that subtly placed them in the past. His concern sounded rehearsed, his expressions timed rather than spontaneous. When asked to describe his emotions, he defaulted to generalities. He appeared more focused on answering correctly than on expressing anything genuine. The absence of emotional disarray was not proof of guilt, but it was incompatible with the situation he claimed to be in. As surveillance footage emerged, the illusion of normalcy grew harder to sustain. His movements were precise, his timing deliberate. There was no evidence of panic, no visible signs of confusion or distress. Each action appeared purposeful, carried out with the same controlled efficiency that had defined his daily routines. The contrast between the gravity of the situation and his composure created a growing sense of unease. Friends and family replayed memories in their minds, searching for moments they might have missed. Conversations were re-examined, videos scrutinized, messages reread. Yet the same conclusions surfaced again and again. There had been no obvious warning signs, no explosive arguments witnessed, no dramatic changes in behavior that demanded immediate concern. Chris Watts had not become someone else. He had simply continued being who he had always been. The truth was not uncovered through a single mistake, but through accumulation. Small inconsistencies, shifting explanations, details that did not align. Each discrepancy weakened the structure of the story he attempted to maintain, and when the weight of evidence became undeniable, his responses did not collapse into remorse. They adjusted. He changed versions. He experimented with narratives. He searched for angles that might preserve some fragment of his self-image. In each iteration, responsibility was diluted, redirected, or reframed. He attempted to present himself as a man pushed beyond his limits, as someone overwhelmed by circumstance. But nothing in his behavior supported that characterization. There was no emotional overflow, no loss of control, only calculation. When confession finally came, it arrived without catharsis. His words described actions, not impact. He recounted events without engaging with their emotional meaning. The lives he had ended were referenced as elements in a sequence rather than as individuals whose absence altered the world. This emotional vacancy was not a response to consequence. It was the same absence that had enabled the crime itself. The public reaction was immediate and visceral. Shock turned to disbelief. Disbelief hardened into horror. The idea that a father could murder his own children not in rage, but in pursuit of personal freedom, challenged deeply held assumptions about family, trust, and safety. People wanted an explanation that restored order, something that made sense of the senseless. But there was no explanation that softened the reality. The absence of a satisfying motive became its own source of terror. There was no ideology, no financial windfall, no external coercion, only a desire to escape responsibility. The simplicity of that motive stripped away distance. It suggested that the conditions for such violence were not exotic or extreme. They were ordinary, familiar, and quietly cultivated. Shanann Watts's final communications revealed a woman aware that something was wrong, but still hopeful that honesty could restore connection. Her messages carried vulnerability, confusion, and determination. She believed in addressing problems directly. She believed in effort. She believed that the man she married could still be reached. That belief, tragically, was grounded in assumptions he no longer shared. Bella and Celeste existed entirely outside the conflict that ended their lives. They trusted without hesitation. They followed without fear. Their understanding of the world was shaped by routine and care, by bedtime rituals and familiar voices. They had no concept of betrayal. That trust was exploited quietly, without resistance, and without mercy. As details of the crime emerged, the manner in which it was carried out became as disturbing as the act itself. There was no frenzy, no visible struggle described in his accounts. The violence was contained, deliberate, and devoid of emotional expression. He did not describe anger. He did not describe fear. He described completion. This detachment continued in the aftermath. He returned to work. He spoke to coworkers. He answered messages. Life proceeded as though a boundary had not been crossed. This capacity to compartmentalize was not sudden. It had been practiced for years, refined through constant emotional suppression. The crime did not create the dissociation. It relied on it. As legal proceedings concluded, there was no dramatic reckoning, no public breakdown, no visible transformation. Chris Watts accepted his sentence with the same emotional flatness that characterized his interactions throughout the case. His statements acknowledged consequences without fully engaging with loss. He spoke of outcomes rather than suffering, of finality rather than grief. In confinement, stripped of routine and distraction, one might expect reflection to reshape identity. Instead, what emerged was stagnation. His language remained centered on himself, on missed opportunities, on the life he no longer had access to. The people he had erased remained abstract, even in memory. This was not denial, it was disconnection. The affair that fueled his fantasy dissolved instantly under the weight of reality. Admiration vanished, possibility collapsed. There was no one waiting, no future to step into. The escape he sought evaporated the moment consequence arrived. Yet even then, his expressions of regret lacked depth. They resembled acknowledgement rather than remorse. For those studying the psychology of family annihilation, the Watts case stands as a stark example of emotional avoidance taken to its extreme conclusion. The pattern is not unfamiliar. A compliant individual, conflict avoidance, a tendency to internalize dissatisfaction rather than express it. What distinguishes this case is not the presence of these traits, but their unchecked progression. Chris Watts did not lack intelligence. He understood social rules. He understood expectations. He understood right and wrong in an abstract sense. What he lacked was emotional integration, the ability to experience responsibility as an internal force rather than an external burden. Without that integration, morality became conditional, something to perform rather than inhabit. This distinction explains why he could perform grief convincingly enough to delay suspicion, yet fail to experience it authentically. Performance had always been sufficient. Throughout his life, agreement substituted for honesty. Compliance substituted for connection. Silence substituted for truth. The house that once symbolized stability became a place frozen in time. Children's belongings remained where they were last left. Schedules no longer applied. The future that had been planned ceased to exist. What remained was absence, heavy and irreversible. The case endures not because of unanswered questions, but because of the answers it provides. It reveals how danger can grow without announcing itself, how emotional repression can harden into indifference, how the refusal to confront discomfort can lead to catastrophic decisions. There was no moment when Chris Watts became someone else. There was only a gradual erosion of connection, empathy, and accountability. When faced with the choice between discomfort and destruction, he chose destruction because it required no confrontation. This reality unsettles because it removes distance. It suggests that extreme violence does not always emerge from extreme emotion. Sometimes it emerges from indifference, from silence, from the steady erosion of responsibility that goes unnoticed until it is complete. And once complete, there is no reversal. The Watts family no longer exists because one man chose himself over everyone else. That choice was made quietly, deliberately, and without remorse. The silence that followed was not accidental. It was the final expression of a life spent avoiding truth. As time passed, the case did not fade into distance. It settled into public consciousness with an unusual weight, not because of unresolved mystery, but because of its clarity. There was no ambiguity about what had happened. The facts were established, the sequence of events confirmed, and yet the discomfort lingered. The story resisted closure because it exposed something deeply unsettling about the nature of normalcy. Chris Watts did not fit the cultural image of a violent offender. He was not volatile. He was not impulsive. He did not display outward hostility. His demeanor challenged the instinctive ways people assess danger. In doing so, the case forced a reconsideration of assumptions that feel comforting but unreliable. It demonstrated that calm is not the opposite of violence, and that politeness does not guarantee safety. When people revisited footage of him standing before cameras, asking for the return of his family, what struck them most was not what he said, but what he did not convey. There was no collapse under the weight of fear, no desperation that spilled beyond rehearsed phrasing. His words sounded correct, but they were emotionally hollow. It was as if he understood the script of grief without understanding grief itself. This distinction mattered. Grief disrupts. It overwhelms. It resists containment. Chris Watts's composure did not fracture under pressure because it had never been rooted in emotional connection. The same detachment that allowed him to erase his family allowed him to speak about their disappearance without internal contradiction. In the months that followed his conviction, the focus shifted from the act to the man. Analysts examined his history not to excuse his behavior, but to understand the conditions that made it possible. What emerged was not a hidden history of violence, but a life defined by avoidance, a pattern of retreat rather than confrontation, a tendency to disappear emotionally when faced with discomfort. This pattern did not make him dangerous by itself. Many people avoid conflict. Many people internalize dissatisfaction. What made Chris Watts dangerous was the extent to which avoidance became his primary mode of existence. Instead of addressing tension, he erased it internally. Instead of expressing resentment, he buried it. Over time, that burial created emotional numbness. And numbness removed barriers that might otherwise have prevented catastrophic action. His relationship with Shanann Watts reflected this imbalance clearly. She was expressive, direct, and persistent in her attempts to communicate. She confronted issues openly, believing that engagement could lead to resolution. He responded with compliance rather than honesty. Each time he agreed without meaning it, the gap between appearance and reality widened. To her, his quietness appeared as patience. To him, it was self-erasure. That difference in perception allowed the relationship to continue outwardly intact while collapsing inwardly. By the time the fracture became visible to her, it had already solidified in him. The children existed entirely outside this dynamic. They were not participants in marital tension. They were recipients of routine, care, and trust. Their world was structured around predictability and safety. That world did not prepare them for betrayal. And betrayal, when it arrived, did not announce itself. It arrived through the same familiar presence that had always guided them. This betrayal remains one of the most difficult aspects of the case to confront. It violates a fundamental expectation of protection. The idea that danger could come from the source of security itself destabilizes deeply held beliefs about family. That destabilization is why the case continues to resonate. In the absence of rage, people search for alternative explanations. They look for psychological labels that might restore distance. Narcissism, sociopathy, detachment. While these frameworks offer language, they do not offer comfort. The truth is more unsettling. Chris Watts was not driven by grandiosity or thrill-seeking. He was driven by the desire to escape discomfort without consequence. This desire shaped every choice he made. It shaped his silence. It shaped his fantasy. It shaped his decision to remove rather than confront. When the fantasy collapsed, it did not produce remorse. It produced resignation. The absence of emotional reckoning was not a failure of expression. It was a reflection of his internal landscape. In confinement, that landscape did not change. Reports of his behavior described consistency rather than transformation. He followed rules. He complied with structure. He did not exhibit outward distress. The same traits that once allowed him to blend into suburban life allowed him to adapt to incarceration. External order replaced internal engagement. The victims, by contrast, were remembered through fragments, videos, messages, photographs, moments frozen in time. Shanann's voice carried urgency and hope. Bella and Celeste's laughter echoed in recordings that now served as reminders of what had been stolen. These fragments underscored the scale of loss precisely because they were so ordinary. They represented lives interrupted, not defined by tragedy until it was imposed upon them. Public fascination with the case often centered on warning signs. People asked what could have been done differently. What indicators were missed? The uncomfortable answer is that there were no dramatic signals to interpret. The danger did not express itself through volatility. It hid behind stability. It grew in silence. This reality challenges conventional narratives about violence. It suggests that harm does not always emerge from chaos. Sometimes it emerges from order, from routines that mask disengagement, from relationships that function outwardly while failing inwardly, from individuals who prioritize appearance over authenticity. The Watts case endures because it offers no reassurance. It does not suggest that vigilance alone can prevent such outcomes. It does not provide a checklist that guarantees safety. Instead, it exposes a vulnerability inherent in human relationships. The reliance on assumed connection. The belief that absence of conflict equals harmony. Chris Watts did not argue his way into violence. He avoided his way into it. Each unspoken truth, each suppressed emotion, each moment of internal retreat contributed to a structure in which erasure felt preferable to honesty. By the time he acted, the internal barriers that might have stopped him were already gone. The story does not end with insight or redemption. It ends with absence. A family erased, a future undone, and a reminder that silence, when left unchecked, can be as destructive as overt hostility. In the years since the crime, attempts to extract meaning from the case have multiplied. Analysts, commentators, and audiences have returned to the same material repeatedly, searching for depth beneath the surface. Yet the most disturbing conclusion remains unchanged. There is no hidden revelation that reframes the story, no concealed trauma that suddenly explains everything, no dramatic turning point where sympathy becomes possible. What exists instead is a sustained absence of empathy, of accountability, of internal resistance to harm. Chris Watts did not perceive himself as a villain. This is not because he lacked awareness of social norms, but because his internal framework placed his own comfort at the center of meaning. Discomfort felt intolerable. Confrontation felt threatening. Responsibility felt oppressive. When those forces converged, his response was not to endure them, but to eliminate their source. That elimination, once rationalized, became executable. This is where the case unsettles most deeply. The mental shift required to commit such acts did not involve frenzy or delusion. It involved disengagement, a narrowing of perspective so complete that other lives ceased to register as fully real. In that narrowed frame, the future existed only for one person. Everyone else became removable. The language Chris Watts used after the fact reflected this narrowing. He spoke in terms of events rather than losses, outcomes rather than impact. He described what happened without engaging with what it meant. This pattern did not indicate shock. It indicated continuity. The same emotional distancing that preceded the murders shaped the way he processed their consequences. When he acknowledged wrongdoing, the acknowledgement remained abstract. There was recognition of facts, but not of suffering. Regret appeared oriented toward lost opportunity rather than inflicted harm. This distinction is subtle but critical. It explains why remorse never fully materialized. Remorse requires the ability to hold another person's pain as central. That capacity was absent long before the crime occurred. Observers often struggle with this absence. They expect guilt to appear eventually, to surface under pressure or time. But guilt cannot develop where emotional integration does not exist. Time does not create empathy. It only reveals whether it was present to begin with. The persistence of public interest reflects a broader anxiety. The case forces confrontation with the limits of perception. People want to believe that danger is detectable, that violence announces itself through instability or aggression. The Watts case contradicts that belief. It demonstrates that emotional emptiness can coexist with politeness, compliance, and routine. This contradiction is difficult to reconcile because it undermines familiar categories. Calm does not guarantee safety. Agreement does not guarantee honesty. Silence does not guarantee peace. These assumptions allow daily life to function, but they are not protections. When they fail, the failure is often invisible until it is complete. The relationship between Chris and Shanann Watts illustrates this invisibility. To external observers, their dynamic appeared imbalanced but functional. She was expressive and directive. He was reserved and accommodating. Many relationships operate within similar structures without collapsing. What distinguished this one was not dominance or submission, but the absence of genuine engagement beneath the roles. Shanann believed that communication could restore connection. She believed that confronting issues directly was an act of care. Her efforts were rooted in the assumption that the person she was speaking to was emotionally available. Chris was not. Each attempt to reconnect reinforced his sense of entrapment rather than intimacy. Not because she was wrong to reach out, but because he lacked the capacity to respond honestly. The tragedy lies in this mismatch. One partner sought resolution through engagement. The other sought relief through erasure. These trajectories could not intersect safely. By the time they diverged completely, the consequences were irreversible. The children, again, were not part of this conflict. They represented continuity, dependence, and responsibility. In the fantasy Chris Watts constructed, those qualities were incompatible with freedom. Instead of confronting that reality, he removed it. This removal was not accompanied by rage or hatred. It was accompanied by emotional neutrality. That neutrality is what makes the act so difficult to process. After the case concluded legally, there was no transformation narrative, no moment where insight softened the reality. Chris Watts did not evolve into a figure of understanding or regret. He remained consistent, compliant, reserved, emotionally distant. The same traits that once allowed him to disappear within suburban life allowed him to adapt to confinement without visible distress. This consistency reinforces the central truth of the case. The crime was not an aberration in his psychological development. It was an end point, the final expression of a pattern that had been forming quietly for years. Avoidance did not break down under pressure. It succeeded in eliminating pressure entirely. The cost of that success was total. For those left behind, there is no narrative resolution. Shanann Watts's family continues to carry the absence of a daughter, a sister, a mother. The children's futures exist only in imagination. Birthdays do not occur. Milestones do not arrive. Time moves forward without them. Public memory preserves fragments. A smile in a photograph, a voice in a video. These fragments do not explain the crime. They resist it. They assert that the victims were more than elements in a story. They were lives with momentum, interrupted by a decision made in silence. The Watts case does not warn through spectacle. It warns through subtlety. It illustrates how emotional disengagement can harden unnoticed, how avoidance can feel harmless until it becomes lethal, how a person can appear stable while internal structures collapse. There is no lesson that restores comfort, only a recognition that responsibility cannot be avoided indefinitely. When it is suppressed rather than confronted, it does not disappear. It accumulates. And when accumulation reaches a critical point, the result can be catastrophic. Chris Watts did not destroy his family in a moment of madness. He destroyed them through a long refusal to engage honestly with his own life. That refusal, sustained over time, removed every barrier that might have stopped him. The silence that followed was not an accident. It was the final outcome of a life shaped by disappearance. What remains most unsettling is not the brutality of the act, but the absence of inner resistance that preceded it. Violence is often imagined as something that erupts, something fueled by overwhelming emotion. In this case, there was no eruption. There was only removal, a quiet subtraction of people from a life that had begun to feel burdensome. That subtraction did not feel extreme to the person carrying it out, because the emotional connection that gives human life weight had already thinned to almost nothing. Chris Watts did not experience the collapse of his family as a loss in the way most people understand loss. He experienced it as the conclusion of a problem. This distinction explains why his behavior after the murders appeared so dissonant. While others expected devastation, he demonstrated relief mixed with inconvenience. The pressure he had felt for years was suddenly gone. What remained was the task of maintaining an image long enough to avoid consequence. When that task failed, the relief disappeared, but the emotional structure did not change. He did not replace relief with grief. He replaced it with resignation. This emotional flatness is not the absence of feeling entirely. It is the absence of connection between feeling and meaning. Without that connection, experiences do not register as morally significant. They register as events to be managed. This is why the case resists emotional resolution. There is no moment where remorse restores balance, no recognition that transforms understanding into closure. The narrative remains suspended in an unresolved space where explanation does not soften impact. For many, this lack of resolution is more disturbing than uncertainty would have been. As the years pass, public engagement with the case shifts from shock to contemplation. The question is no longer how such a crime could occur, but how easily it could go unnoticed. The absence of overt warning signs challenges the assumption that vigilance alone is sufficient. It suggests that danger can coexist with stability, and that familiarity can obscure fracture. The Watts family lived within systems designed to protect community, routine, visibility. None of these systems failed dramatically. They simply did not detect what was never expressed. Emotional disengagement leaves no physical trace. It does not trigger alarms. It does not announce itself. By the time it manifests externally, it is often too late. This reality reframes the role of responsibility in human relationships. Responsibility is not only about providing and performing. It is about engaging, about confronting discomfort rather than avoiding it, about acknowledging dissatisfaction before it becomes destructive. Chris Watts did not lack opportunity to choose differently. He lacked the willingness to tolerate discomfort long enough to make a different choice. The tragedy, then, is not rooted in inevitability. It is rooted in avoidance. Each moment of silence was a decision. Each unspoken truth reinforced a pattern. Over time, those decisions accumulated into a psychological structure in which erasure felt preferable to honesty. The case also exposes a cultural discomfort with conflict. Silence is often praised as maturity, compliance as stability, calm as virtue. Yet when these traits replace engagement rather than support it, they can conceal profound disconnection. The Watts case illustrates the danger of mistaking surface harmony for emotional health. Shanann Watts did not fail to notice tension. She recognized it and attempted to address it. Her efforts were grounded in the belief that problems could be resolved through communication. That belief assumes reciprocity. It assumes that the other person is willing to engage. When that assumption fails, effort alone cannot restore connection. The children were never part of this breakdown. Their lives were shaped by routine, trust, and care. They relied entirely on the adults around them to maintain safety. That reliance was absolute. The violation of that trust is what continues to resonate most painfully. It represents a breach not only of individual responsibility, but of a fundamental social expectation. The aftermath of the case offers no redemption arc. Chris Watts remains confined, but confinement does not produce insight where emotional capacity is absent. He exists within structure without internal transformation. The same emotional distance that enabled the crime persists. For those who continue to examine the case, its significance lies not in spectacle, but in warning. It warns of the cost of emotional avoidance, of the danger inherent in prioritizing appearance over authenticity, of the consequences of refusing to confront discomfort. There is no simple takeaway that restores comfort. Only a recognition that human connection requires active participation. That responsibility must be engaged, not endured. And that silence, when used to escape rather than to reflect, can become lethal. The Watts family is remembered not because of how they died, but because of how ordinary their lives were before they ended. That ordinariness is what gives the case its enduring power. It reminds us that destruction does not always arrive with chaos. Sometimes it arrives quietly, carried by a person who never learned how to stay present when staying present became difficult. And once that presence is lost, the damage is irreversible. Even now, the story resists the kind of meaning people want it to offer. There is no lesson that restores order, no insight that makes the outcome feel contained. What remains is an uneasy awareness that the conditions for this kind of destruction were not extraordinary. They were familiar. They existed within a life that looked stable, within routines that felt safe, within a relationship that functioned outwardly even as it failed inwardly. Chris Watts did not live on the margins of society. He lived within its expectations. He worked steadily. He maintained appearances. He complied with norms. In many ways, he embodied the traits often associated with reliability. That embodiment is what allowed the danger to go unnoticed. It is also what complicates the instinct to separate this case from ordinary life. The discomfort people feel when revisiting the case comes from recognition rather than difference. the structure of avoidance, the preference for peace over honesty, the impulse to endure rather than confront. These are not foreign tendencies. They are common. What is rare is their unchecked progression to a point where empathy collapses entirely. The erosion of empathy did not occur because Chris Watts was overwhelmed. It occurred because he disengaged. Each moment of withdrawal reduced the emotional reality of others. Over time, that reduction became complete. When he acted, he was not reacting to emotion. He was executing a decision already made internally. This internal decision-making process explains the absence of hesitation in his actions. Hesitation arises when competing values collide. In this case, there was no collision. The value placed on personal relief outweighed all others. Without emotional integration, moral barriers did not assert themselves. What remained was efficiency. The idea of efficiency applied to human lives is difficult to confront. It violates fundamental assumptions about attachment and care, yet it is central to understanding the crime. Chris Watts approached the situation as a logistical problem rather than a moral one. That framing did not develop overnight. It was the endpoint of a long disengagement from emotional responsibility. After the crime, attempts to reconstruct motive often gravitated toward external explanations. Financial stress, relationship conflict, infidelity. These factors provide context, but they do not explain the act. Many people experience similar pressures without committing violence. What distinguishes this case is not pressure, but the absence of internal resistance to harmful action. Internal resistance is built through engagement, through argument, through failure, through the willingness to endure discomfort without erasing its source. Chris Watts avoided these experiences. In doing so, he avoided the development of emotional resilience. When faced with a crisis that demanded confrontation, he chose elimination instead. The silence that followed the murders was not merely the absence of sound. It was the absence of relational meaning. The house no longer functioned as a home because the relationships that gave it purpose were gone. What remained were objects without context, rooms without routine, spaces emptied of intention. This emptiness extended beyond the physical environment. It entered public discourse. Conversations about the case often circle back to the same unresolved tension. How could this happen without warning? The answer remains uncomfortable. It happened quietly. It happened incrementally. It happened within a framework that rewarded compliance and discouraged conflict. The Watts case exposes a blind spot in how danger is understood. It challenges the belief that stability is protective, that calm is reassuring, that silence is neutral. In this story, silence was not neutral. It was active. It shaped choices. It narrowed perspective. It allowed disengagement to harden into indifference. For those who continue to study the case, its value lies not in shock, but in reflection. It asks difficult questions about how emotional disengagement is recognized and addressed, about how avoidance is normalized. about how relationships function when one participant withdraws while maintaining appearances. Shanann Watts did not misinterpret silence as contentment. She sensed distance and attempted to close it. Her efforts reflect a belief in connection that was not reciprocated. That lack of reciprocity is where the danger resided. Not in conflict, but in the absence of it. The children's trust stands as the most painful reminder of what was lost. Their reliance was complete, their vulnerability absolute. The fact that such reliance could be betrayed without visible struggle underscores the depth of emotional absence involved. It was not cruelty in the conventional sense. It was indifference. Indifference does not announce itself. It does not provoke immediate alarm. It blends into routine. It hides behind politeness. It is often mistaken for calm. In this case, indifference was the most destructive force at work. As the years continue to pass, the case remains unchanged in its core meaning. It does not become easier to understand. It does not soften with time. It remains a stark illustration of what happens when responsibility is avoided rather than engaged. Chris Watts will spend the rest of his life confined, but confinement does not resolve the questions his actions raised. It does not restore what was lost. It does not create empathy where it never existed. It simply marks the end of his choices. For the rest of us, the story endures as a caution, not about monsters hiding in plain sight, but about the consequences of disengagement, about the danger of equating calm with health, about the cost of silence when it is used to escape rather than to reflect. The Watts family is remembered not for spectacle, but for absence. Their story persists because it resists simplification. It refuses to offer comfort. It remains a reminder that the most catastrophic failures do not always come from explosive emotion, but from quiet, sustained withdrawal. And once that withdrawal becomes complete, nothing remains to stop the fall. What makes the story endure is that it does not resolve into a single moment of horror. It stretches backward, dissolving into years of ordinary decisions that appeared harmless in isolation. Each decision to remain silent, each decision to agree without conviction, each decision to suppress rather than confront. None of these choices looked dangerous on their own. Together, they formed a path that led to irrevocable harm. Chris Watts did not arrive at violence through escalation. There was no visible buildup, no series of explosive incidents that signaled a breaking point. Instead, there was a narrowing. His emotional world contracted until only one outcome felt tolerable. In that contraction, other lives lost their gravity. They became weight rather than presence, barriers rather than bonds. This narrowing explains why the act itself was carried out without apparent struggle. Struggle requires internal conflict. It requires opposing forces within the self. In this case, those forces had already been silenced. What remained was alignment between desire and action. The absence of hesitation was not bravery or resolve. It was emptiness. After the crime, the world expected collapse. It expected visible consequences in his demeanor, his speech, his posture. Instead, it encountered continuity. He behaved as he always had, contained, compliant, emotionally distant. That continuity was perhaps the most unsettling revelation of all. It suggested that the act had not shattered his identity. It had completed it. The public fixation on this case often centers on the idea of hidden evil. But evil, in this context, was not flamboyant or dramatic. It was banal. It emerged from everyday avoidance, from the refusal to engage honestly with discomfort. It was not driven by hatred, but by indifference. Not by rage, but by withdrawal. Indifference is difficult to detect because it mimics neutrality. It presents as calm, as restraint, as patience. In many social contexts, these traits are praised. They are interpreted as maturity. The Watts case disrupts that interpretation. It shows how restraint without engagement can hollow out responsibility until nothing remains. The relationship between appearance and reality is central to this story. Outwardly, the Watts family appeared stable. Inwardly, the emotional structure had already fractured. That fracture did not produce visible chaos. It produced silence. Silence allowed routine to continue. Routine concealed disconnection. Disconnection enabled erasure. The crime did not shatter a functioning family. It erased a family that had already ceased to exist emotionally for one of its members. That distinction does not lessen the tragedy. It deepens it. It reveals how absence can precede loss, and how loss can arrive without warning. Shanann Watts believed in visibility. She shared her life openly. She confronted issues directly. Her approach assumed that transparency invited resolution. Chris Watts's approach assumed that silence preserved peace. These assumptions were incompatible. Where she saw connection, he saw exposure. Where she sought engagement, he sought escape. The children existed entirely within the structure of trust. Their understanding of the world was shaped by consistency and care. They had no framework for betrayal. That framework failed them completely. The violation of their trust remains the most enduring wound left by the case. In the aftermath, the legal system provided resolution but not meaning. A sentence was imposed. Facts were recorded. Procedures completed. None of these steps addressed the emotional vacuum at the center of the story. They could not. Systems can punish behavior. They cannot restore empathy. Chris Watts's continued existence within confinement underscores this limitation. He follows structure. He complies with rules. He maintains the same emotional distance that characterized his life before the crime. There is no dramatic reckoning, no visible transformation. The absence persists. For those who encounter this story, the discomfort lies in its proximity. It does not belong to a distant world of extremes. It belongs to familiar spaces, suburban streets, family homes, daily routines. The ordinariness of the setting removes distance and invites reflection. The case asks uncomfortable questions about how people assess safety, about how emotional disengagement is normalized, about how silence is interpreted. It suggests that danger is not always loud or chaotic. Sometimes it is quiet, consistent, and socially acceptable. This is why the Watts case continues to unsettle long after the details are known. It does not allow for easy categorization. It resists being framed as an anomaly. It insists on being understood as the extreme outcome of common tendencies left unchecked. The story does not conclude with insight or resolution. It lingers in absence, a family erased, a future undone, a silence that cannot be filled. And that silence remains not as a mystery to be solved, but as a warning that cannot be ignored. The warning embedded in this silence is not dramatic. It does not arrive as fear or alarm. It arrives as unease, as the realization that what feels stable may simply be unchallenged, that what feels calm may simply be disengaged, that what feels safe may simply be familiar. Chris Watts did not live a visibly chaotic life. He lived a managed one. His days followed patterns. His behavior adhered to expectation. He fulfilled roles without inhabiting them. Husband, father, employee, neighbor. Each role was performed competently enough to avoid scrutiny, yet without the emotional investment that gives roles meaning. Over time, performance replaced presence. Presence requires risk. It requires disagreement. It requires the willingness to be seen in discomfort. Chris Watts avoided these risks consistently. He chose silence over vulnerability, compliance over honesty, withdrawal over confrontation. These choices did not draw attention. They did not cause conflict. They appeared on the surface to preserve harmony, but harmony without engagement is fragile. As his internal world narrowed, the external world remained unchanged. Bills were paid, schedules maintained, smiles exchanged. The absence of visible disruption reinforced the illusion that nothing was wrong. This illusion did not protect the family. It concealed the process by which one member was emotionally disappearing. The idea of disappearance is central to understanding this case. Chris Watts did not suddenly remove others from his life. He removed himself first. He withdrew emotionally long before he acted physically. By the time violence occurred, the emotional severance had already been completed internally. The act itself was the final step in a process that had been unfolding quietly for years. This internal disappearance explains the absence of panic afterward. Panic arises when reality conflicts with expectation. In his case, reality aligned with the internal narrative he had already accepted. The lives he erased had already been erased emotionally. What followed was not shock, but continuation. Continuation is unsettling because it suggests that the act did not disrupt his sense of self. It confirmed it. He moved forward as he always had, contained, compliant, detached. The world expected rupture. He offered routine. Routine, however, cannot sustain meaning. It can only sustain behavior. Meaning requires connection. Without connection, actions become procedural. This procedural mindset shaped every phase of the crime, from decision to execution to aftermath. When observers attempt to locate remorse in his words, they often encounter confusion. He expresses regret, but it lacks depth. He acknowledges harm, but it remains abstract. This is not deception in the traditional sense. It is limitation. Remorse requires the ability to experience another's suffering as emotionally significant. That ability was absent long before the crime. The persistence of this absence is what prevents closure. Time does not repair what was never present. Reflection does not generate empathy where it did not exist. Confinement does not cultivate connection. The internal landscape remains unchanged. The victims, by contrast, are remembered through the fullness of their presence. Shanann Watts's voice conveys urgency, hope, determination. Bella and Celeste's laughter conveys trust, curiosity, innocence. These qualities stand in stark contrast to the emptiness that ended their lives. The contrast intensifies the loss. Public engagement with the case often oscillates between analysis and disbelief. People want to understand how to prevent similar outcomes. They search for markers, warning signs, patterns that can be isolated and avoided. Yet the most significant pattern in this case is one that is rarely addressed directly: the normalization of emotional avoidance. Avoidance is not inherently dangerous. It becomes dangerous when it replaces engagement entirely, when discomfort is never confronted, when dissatisfaction is never expressed, when responsibility is endured rather than owned. Over time, avoidance can hollow out emotional capacity. When that capacity collapses, moral barriers weaken. The Watts case illustrates this collapse with devastating clarity. It shows how a person can function outwardly while disengaging inwardly, how stability can coexist with erosion, how silence can carry consequences far beyond its apparent harmlessness. This is why the case remains relevant. It does not belong solely to the realm of crime. It belongs to the realm of human behavior. It challenges assumptions about safety, responsibility, and connection. It forces recognition that presence matters, that engagement matters, that discomfort, when addressed honestly, is not a threat but a safeguard. Chris Watts chose relief over responsibility. That choice was not made in a moment of chaos. It was made gradually, through countless small acts of withdrawal. When the final decision came, there was nothing left to oppose it. The silence that followed was complete. There is no restorative ending to this story, no resolution that balances loss, no insight that redeems destruction. There is only the enduring absence left behind by a decision made without empathy. And that absence remains, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a reminder of what can happen when silence replaces truth, when avoidance replaces engagement, and when a life is lived without presence, until presence itself disappears. Absence left behind does not fade with repetition. Each retelling reinforces the same unease, because the core truth remains unchanged. This was not a story driven by chaos, desperation, or uncontrollable emotion. It was a story driven by disengagement, by the steady removal of oneself from responsibility until responsibility no longer felt real. Chris Watts did not see himself as someone capable of destruction. He saw himself as someone cornered by expectations. In his internal logic, the problem was not violence. The problem was discomfort. Violence was simply the mechanism that promised to eliminate it. That logic did not arise from distortion or delusion. It arose from years of prioritizing relief over accountability. Accountability requires friction. It requires the willingness to tolerate being seen in conflict, to accept disapproval, to endure failure. Chris Watts avoided these experiences consistently. He did not learn how to argue honestly. He did not learn how to disappoint others openly. He learned how to comply outwardly while withdrawing inwardly. That pattern allowed resentment to accumulate without ever being processed. Resentment, when left unexamined, does not dissipate. It hardens. It strips others of dimensionality. It reframes relationships as burdens rather than bonds. In this case, resentment did not express itself as anger. It expressed itself as indifference. Indifference allowed erasure to feel permissible. The fantasy that emerged alongside this indifference was not elaborate. It was simple. A life without obligation, without explanation, without consequence. In that fantasy, removal replaced resolution. The complexity of human relationships was reduced to a logistical problem. That reduction made violence conceivable without emotional collapse. When observers try to locate the precise moment where everything changed, they often look for a dramatic turning point. But there was no such moment. The change was gradual, incremental, and internally contained. By the time it became visible externally, it was complete. This gradualness is what makes prevention difficult. There were no alarms to sound, no crises to interrupt the pattern. The system functioned until it didn't. And when it failed absolutely. The role of silence in this story cannot be overstated. Silence was not passive. It was active. It shaped perception. It narrowed options. It allowed avoidance to masquerade as peace. Each unspoken truth reinforced the belief that confrontation was dangerous and escape was preferable. In many contexts, silence is interpreted as maturity, as self-control, as restraint. The Watts case exposes the danger of that assumption when silence replaces engagement rather than supporting it. Silence without connection does not preserve relationships. It empties them. Shanann Watts attempted to fill that silence with communication. Her efforts were direct, emotional, and persistent. She believed that honesty, even when uncomfortable, was necessary for repair. That belief required a partner capable of meeting her emotionally. Chris Watts was not. This mismatch created a dynamic where one person moved toward engagement while the other moved toward disappearance. These movements did not cancel each other out. They intensified the divide. The more she reached, the more trapped he felt. The more trapped he felt, the more he withdrew. The children remained untouched by this dynamic until the very end. Their lives were structured around care, routine, and trust. They did not experience emotional distance as adults do. They experienced presence or absence. The presence they relied on did not protect them. The betrayal of that trust remains the most difficult element to confront. It violates a foundational assumption about safety. It undermines the belief that care and harm are mutually exclusive. In this case, harm arrived through the same hands that provided comfort. After the crime, the public searched for signs of internal collapse. They expected guilt to surface. They expected grief to break through the calm exterior. What they encountered instead was consistency. The same emotional flatness, the same procedural language, the same absence of internal struggle. This consistency is not evidence of strength. It is evidence of limitation. The capacity for remorse requires the capacity for emotional connection. Without that capacity, acknowledgement remains intellectual. Loss remains abstract. Consequence remains administrative. The legal system provided an ending, but it did not provide understanding. Understanding cannot be imposed. It must be internal. In this case, the internal landscape remained unchanged. The Watts family's story persists because it forces confrontation with uncomfortable truths. That violence does not always stem from hatred. That destruction does not always announce itself. That avoidance, when left unchecked, can become catastrophic. There is no comfort to be drawn from this narrative, only caution. The recognition that emotional presence is not optional. That engagement is not merely desirable, but necessary. That silence, when used to evade rather than to reflect, can hollow out responsibility until nothing remains to restrain action. Chris Watts chose escape over honesty. That choice unfolded quietly, over time, without interruption. When it reached its conclusion, the damage was irreversible. The silence that followed was not an ending. It was the final shape of a life built on disappearance. The final shape of that disappearance continues to unsettle because it offers no boundary between the extraordinary and the ordinary. It does not belong to a distant category of human behavior that can be safely dismissed. It exists uncomfortably close to familiar patterns, avoidance mistaken for calm, compliance mistaken for stability, silence mistaken for peace. Chris Watts did not live as an outsider. He lived within expectations that reward predictability and discourage disruption. He learned how to meet obligations without revealing dissatisfaction, how to satisfy surface requirements while withholding inner truth. Over time, this skill became his identity. He did not experience himself as deceptive. He experienced himself as contained. Containment, however, is not connection. It does not integrate emotion, it suppresses it. Suppression does not eliminate feeling. It severs it from meaning. When meaning erodes, moral weight follows. Actions become manageable because they are no longer felt as relationally significant. This erosion is difficult to detect from the outside because it leaves no obvious marks. It does not escalate loudly. It does not demand intervention. It proceeds quietly, sustained by routine and reinforced by the absence of visible conflict. The very smoothness of daily life becomes its camouflage. In this case, the camouflage was effective until it was complete. By the time anyone noticed rupture, the internal decision had already been made. There was no space left for interruption. No leverage point where honesty could redirect outcome. The internal narrative had closed. That closure explains why there was no turning back, why the act unfolded without hesitation, why the aftermath did not produce visible collapse. When an internal story resolves fully in one direction, alternative futures lose their emotional pull. They cease to feel real. The concept of reality itself becomes narrowed. What exists is what aligns with relief. Everything else becomes interference. This narrowing has implications beyond this single case. It reveals how emotional disengagement can distort perception without appearing pathological. The person remains functional, polite, cooperative. The danger does not lie in dysfunction, but in absence. Absence of empathy, absence of accountability, absence of internal dialogue that challenges harmful impulses. Chris Watts did not argue with himself in the moment of decision. Argument requires opposing values. In his internal landscape, opposition had already been removed. What remained was a single priority: escape from discomfort. The consequences of that escape were immediate and permanent, but even consequence did not restore connection. It imposed limits without creating insight. Confinement replaced routine, but the emotional structure remained intact. External control substituted for internal engagement. This substitution reinforces the unease surrounding the case. It suggests that punishment can contain behavior without transforming the self. It suggests that resolution at a procedural level does not equate to resolution at a human one. For those who revisit the story, this gap between outcome and understanding is where discomfort persists. The facts are known. The sequence is established, yet the emotional center remains hollow. There is no shared grief to connect observer and offender, only separation. The victims, by contrast, remain vivid through memory. Their presence is preserved in detail, in tone of voice, in movement, in expectation. These details resist abstraction. They insist on being felt. They stand as a counterweight to the emptiness that ended their lives. This contrast between fullness and absence is the enduring tension of the case. It cannot be resolved by explanation. It must be held. The Watts family's story does not function as a cautionary tale in the traditional sense. It does not offer a checklist or a formula. It offers a confrontation with subtlety, with the ways in which disengagement can masquerade as composure, with the danger of assuming that lack of conflict equals health. It also forces recognition that responsibility is not passive. It must be exercised. It must be renewed. It must be felt. When responsibility is treated as an external burden rather than an internal commitment, it becomes something to escape rather than uphold. Chris Watts escaped by erasing. That erasure did not begin with violence. It began with withdrawal, with silence, with the refusal to engage honestly when engagement became uncomfortable, The violence was simply the final expression of a pattern long established. The silence that remains is not empty of meaning. It carries the weight of what was avoided. It speaks to the cost of disengagement. It lingers as a reminder that presence is not optional, and that when it is surrendered completely, the consequences extend far beyond the self. When you are ready, write continue, and the narrative will move forward without interruption, maintaining the same tone and progression toward the full length. That progression does not move toward revelation. It moves toward recognition. Recognition that what feels distant is, in fact, close. That the forces at work in this case are not exotic or rare, but familiar and often unexamined. The story endures because it refuses to remain safely contained within the category of crime. It reaches outward, implicating everyday assumptions about character, stability, and trust. Chris Watts was not propelled by a hunger for domination or notoriety. He did not seek recognition. He sought relief. Relief from expectations he never challenged. Relief from roles he never renegotiated. Relief from a life he participated in without inhabiting. That relief became his central organizing principle, quietly displacing all others. When relief becomes paramount, morality becomes negotiable, not through conscious rejection, but through neglect. Values that are not engaged lose force. Empathy that is not exercised weakens. Responsibility that is endured rather than embraced becomes something to shed. Over time, the internal framework that restrains harmful action erodes without visible strain. This erosion explains why the act did not feel transgressive to him in the way it would to others. Transgression requires a boundary to be crossed. In his internal world, the boundary had already dissolved. What remained was a procedural task aligned with a singular goal. The absence of inner conflict made the act feel, to him, disturbingly coherent. The coherence of his behavior, before, during, and after, confounded observers because it contradicted expectations. People anticipate rupture after violence. They expect the self to fracture under the weight of consequence. Instead, they encountered continuity, the same demeanor, the same restraint, the same emotional distance. Continuity suggested that the crime was not an interruption, but a culmination. That realization shifts the focus from the moment of violence to the years that preceded it, to the countless small moments when honesty could have intervened, when discomfort could have been tolerated, when responsibility could have been renegotiated rather than escaped. None of those moments demanded heroism. They demanded presence. Presence is not dramatic. It does not attract attention. It is sustained through listening, through disagreement, through the willingness to be seen when one would rather disappear. Presence was what Chris Watts relinquished long before the crime occurred. Its absence was not noticed because absence is quiet. The social environment surrounding him did not challenge this absence. Compliance was rewarded. Calm was praised. Conflict was avoided. These norms did not cause the crime, but they did not interrupt the pattern either. They provided a context in which withdrawal could proceed unchecked. This does not assign blame outward. It clarifies vulnerability. It shows how systems designed to promote harmony can inadvertently conceal disengagement. It shows how politeness can obscure truth, how routine can mask erosion. Shanann Watts's approach to life stood in contrast to this concealment. She valued expression. She believed in addressing problems directly. Her efforts were not failures of perception. They were attempts to restore presence in a relationship that had already hollowed. Her reaching did not provoke violence. It collided with an emptiness that could not respond. The children, again, represent the most painful collision of all. Their world was structured around trust. They relied on presence as a given. That reliance was absolute, and it was violated without warning. The betrayal did not require deception in the moment. It relied on the continuity of routine, on the assumption that familiar hands are safe. This assumption is foundational to human life. Its violation destabilizes more than individual families. It unsettles collective confidence in the ordinary. That is why the case lingers. It challenges the belief that normalcy protects. It suggests that protection requires engagement, not appearance. In the aftermath, the legal outcome provided certainty but not solace. Certainty answers questions of fact. Solace requires shared humanity. In this case, shared humanity was absent on one side of the equation. The imbalance remains. Chris Watts's continued existence within confinement does not resolve this imbalance. It confirms it. He remains consistent, contained, emotionally distant. There is no arc of transformation to follow, no insight to absorb. The narrative does not bend toward redemption because redemption requires recognition of another's suffering as central. That recognition never arrives. What remains, then, is a story defined by its edges, by what is missing rather than what is present, by the absence of empathy, the absence of engagement, the absence of internal resistance to harm. These absences are not abstract. They have tangible consequences. The Watts family's absence is one such consequence. The silence in their home, the futures that never unfolded, the routines that ended without conclusion. These are not metaphors. They are realities shaped by a decision made without presence. The warning embedded here is quiet and persistent. It cautions against equating calm with health, against mistaking compliance for connection, against assuming that silence is benign. It urges attention to engagement, not as an ideal but as a necessity. When engagement is relinquished, when presence is surrendered, the self narrows. And when the self narrows far enough, harm becomes possible without feeling like harm. That is the uncomfortable truth this case leaves behind. It does not accuse. It does not explain away. It simply remains, insisting that presence matters, that avoidance accumulates, and that silence, when used to escape rather than to reflect, can become catastrophic. The catastrophe did not arrive as a rupture in time. It arrived as a conclusion that had already been rehearsed internally. By the time the external world became aware of what had happened, The internal world that made it possible had long since settled into stillness. There was no chaos left to resolve, only consequence. This is why the case resists emotional distance. It does not offer the relief of separation between the person who committed the crime and the world most people recognize. Instead, it collapses that distance. It suggests that the path to destruction is not always marked by obvious warning signs, but by subtle permissions granted to disengagement over time. Chris Watts granted himself those permissions quietly, each time he chose not to speak honestly, each time he chose to endure resentment rather than express it, each time he opted for internal retreat instead of relational risk. None of these moments demanded immediate attention. None of them disrupted routine. They simply accumulated. Accumulation is slow. It does not announce itself. It builds beneath the surface, invisible to those who are not looking for it. And even when it reaches a critical point, it may still appear as calm. The external world continues to function. The internal world, however, has already narrowed. Narrowing reduces complexity. It simplifies moral landscapes. It reframes relationships as obstacles or conveniences rather than as bonds. In this simplified frame, choices that would once have been unthinkable begin to appear manageable. The absence of complexity is not clarity. It is collapse. This collapse did not produce visible distress in Chris Watts because distress requires emotional engagement. Engagement had already been surrendered. What remained was alignment between desire and action, unchallenged by competing values. The absence of internal conflict made the act feel, to him, disturbingly straightforward. Afterward, the world waited for signs of fracture, for grief to break through the composure, for guilt to register in voice or posture. Instead, it encountered consistency, the same quiet demeanor, the same restrained speech, the same emotional distance. This consistency unsettled observers because it contradicted expectations of human response to loss. But there was no loss to register internally. The loss had occurred emotionally long before the act. What followed was not mourning, but management. Managing appearances, managing questions, managing consequence. When management failed, acceptance followed, not as remorse, but as resignation. Resignation is not the same as understanding. It does not engage with harm. It simply acknowledges outcome. This distinction explains why expressions of regret remained shallow. Regret oriented toward self does not require empathy. Remorse oriented toward others does. The absence of remorse is often misunderstood as cruelty. In this case, it was absence. Absence of the internal structures that allow another's pain to be felt as significant. That absence did not emerge after the crime. It preceded it. The enduring discomfort of the case lies in this realization that the crime was not a departure from identity, but its final expression. That the calm before, during, and after was not a mask that slipped, but the surface of an emptiness that remained intact. The Watts family's story persists because it forces confrontation with that emptiness. It does not allow the comfort of externalizing danger. It does not permit easy explanations. It insists on being understood as the outcome of disengagement rather than explosion. This insistence has implications beyond this case. It challenges the ways in which emotional avoidance is normalized. It questions the assumption that harmony equals health. It exposes the risk of prioritizing appearance over presence. Presence is not guaranteed by proximity. It is cultivated through engagement, through disagreement, through vulnerability, through the willingness to tolerate discomfort rather than erase its source. Presence was what disappeared first in this story. The violence was its final echo. Shanann Watts's insistence on communication represented an attempt to restore presence. Her efforts were not acts of control, but of connection. They assumed a partner capable of reciprocal engagement. That capacity was no longer available. The children's trust represented presence in its purest form, unconditional, unquestioning, entirely dependent on the integrity of those responsible for them. That trust was not broken gradually. It was extinguished. The finality of that extinguishing is what continues to haunt. It leaves no space for reinterpretation, no room for mitigation, only absence. In the end, the story does not ask for fascination. It asks for attention. Attention to the quiet patterns that precede visible collapse. Attention to the costs of avoidance. Attention to the necessity of engagement. Chris Watts's life demonstrates what can happen when engagement is surrendered entirely, when silence becomes a strategy rather than a pause, when responsibility is endured rather than owned, when relief is valued above all else. The result was not freedom, it was erasure. And that erasure remains, not as an anomaly, but as a warning that cannot be dismissed, only understood. There is no ending that restores balance to this story, no conclusion that softens what was taken or explains it away. What remains is absence, quiet, permanent, and unresolved. A family erased not by chaos or uncontrollable rage, but by a series of choices made in silence. Chris Watts did not destroy his family in a moment of madness. He dismantled it gradually, long before the violence occurred, by withdrawing from responsibility, from honesty, from emotional presence. The murders were not the beginning of the tragedy. They were its final confirmation. This case endures because it offers no comfort. It does not reassure us that danger is always visible, or that evil announces itself clearly. It reveals something far more unsettling, that destruction can grow unnoticed within ordinary lives, behind polite behavior and predictable routines, sustained by avoidance rather than hostility. Shanann Watts lived with visibility, effort, and belief in connection. Bella and Celeste lived with trust. Their lives were not defined by tragedy until someone else chose to erase them rather than face discomfort. Their absence is not symbolic. It is real, measurable, and irreversible. Chris Watts will remain confined, but confinement does not resolve what this story exposes. It does not restore empathy where it never existed. It does not transform avoidance into understanding. It only marks the end of his ability to act. For everyone else, the case leaves a quieter responsibility. To recognize that silence is not always harmless, that calm is not always healthy, that disengagement, when left unchecked, can hollow out the very structures that make restraint possible. This is not a story about monsters hiding in plain sight. It is a story about disappearance, about what happens when a person slowly removes themselves from emotional responsibility until nothing remains to restrain them. And once that point is reached, no explanation can undo the damage. No insight can restore what was lost. Only absence remains.